Well, let's start. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this virtual European workshop. I am Sonia Parella, the coordinator of the Center of Research CER-MIGRACIONS at UAB, Autonomous University of Barcelona. On behalf of all the consortium of this European project, with all our partners, Diotima from Greece, Papatia from Germany, Waterfarm from Belgium, and Fundació Surt from Spain. It's a pleasure for us to hold today this event, this European workshop, within the framework of a research project, finding out ways out of forced marriage, prevention, protection, and support tools for practitioners across Europe. This project, FM Out, aims to equip professionals working directly or indirectly with potential victims of forced marriage with competences and tools. This project is funded by the European Union's Right, Equality and Citizenship program. And we are privileged today with the participation of our colleague, Sundari Anitha, from the University of Lincoln in United Kingdom. She is one of the most important international experts about this topic. She's an author and leading researcher for more than 2 decades. She has been active not only in research, but also in policy making to address forced marriage and other types of violence against women. She has been a constant source of inspiration for our project. She's one of the authors, together with Aisha Gil, of the emblematic book from 2011, where they adapt the notion of continuum to the holistic understanding of forced marriage. The book is Forced Marriage, Introducing Social Justice and Human Rights Perspective. Today, the conference title is Coercion, Consent, and Forced Marriage. We are very interested in these contents. And at the end of the conference, we are opening the floor to questions and to involve all the audience. Thank you very much again for being here today. Thank you very much, Sundari Anitha. It's a great pleasure to listen to you. And it's up to you, and if you want, you can start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia, and your colleagues for having me here, and thank you, everyone. And it's a shame because of the pandemic I can't meet you all. It would have been great to connect across different countries and to identify common issues that we're all trying to deal with, but in our own different contexts, which is what really interests me. So today I'm going to talk to you about understanding, conceptualizing, and responding to forced marriage. And my focus is on understanding these issues at the intersection of gender, sexuality, disability, race, etc. So just to start with, in terms of how do we conceptualize forced marriage, and I've always found in my work, in my academic work, but also in my practice. So I also have been involved in frontline work in domestic violence organizations. So I was a caseworker at a refuge for South Asian women, and I was also a manager at a generic refuge. And so through all that work, I've always found that how we conceptualize a problem has a great bearing on how we might understand women's narratives and how we might craft appropriate responses to it. And Aisha and I have been thinking about this issue of forced marriage for a while in terms of how do we conceptualize forced marriage. And if we start with the definition, the original definition, a simple understanding of forced marriage is a marriage to which one or both the parties do not consent. So it seems fairly straightforward, yeah? But the key question here is how do we define and how do we understand coercion and consent. So when we talk about consent, we think of what's not consent. And so we often come up with the term coercion. So how do we understand these two terms? And what we argue is that we need to move away from a binary understanding of consent and coercion to that of a continuum. So binary is they're both opposed to each other. They're both at different ends of the scale. So coercion, in terms of trying to understand what coercion itself is, we now have a fairly strong understanding of how coercion can be by a direct agent. So it can be from someone who's there, who's present, so another person, and they can use physical force as well as emotional pressure. So we've moved on. Earlier, we used to focus on physical force. Now we also know emotional pressure can have a very coercive force. But how do we understand, it should say less tangible. How do we understand less tangible forces such as socioeconomic factors? So they're not being exercised directly by an agent. They're present in the world around us. They're broader, less tangible forces. So how can they play a coercive role in our decision making? And that's something we've been working on for more than a decade, and that's something I'm really grappling with even now, because in the middle of this week, talking to you, preparing this presentation, I've also been analyzing some data from some interviews we've been doing in the US on forced stroke child marriage, where again I've been grappling with this context, socioeconomic context, and I'll refer to it later. So we argue that this understanding of coercion and consent, dichotomous, they're separate from each other. It needs to be questioned in the context of marriage decisions, or perhaps all decisions. For example, a decision to have an abortion, women make that decision in the context of a whole range of other factors that they weigh up. So we are going through, in the UK, we're going through a huge cost of living crisis at the moment. So there's economic factors that you have to weigh in when you think about whether you can afford to bring up a child, whether you can afford, if you're in a precarious job, whether you can afford to withdraw from the labor market because you're unlikely to have maternity leave, maternity pay. So in that context, that's an economic choice. It's a choice that may be crucially shaped by the broader socioeconomic context. In the absence of direct coercion, you may still feel a coercive pressure from your economic context, which shapes your choices. So in coming back to forced marriage, in a non-coercive egalitarian context, arranged and forced marriage will look very different, because in arranged marriage, the family may propose that you meet someone and you can say no, or you can say yes. You can decide when. You can say yes and say, but not now. In 1 or 2 years, I want to get to know them. In 2 years or 1 year, we plan to get married. But if in that 1 year it doesn't work out, we can say no. So you can negotiate things, and so it looks very different from a marriage where you ask to meet someone and then the assumption is you will say yes. There's no option to say no. So, for instance, for our recent project, the last interview we did was from someone from an Orthodox Jewish community, and they were talking about how within their particular context, they had the family introduce them to someone, and they had 20 minutes to meet that person, but the phrase was, "You're just checking if they have a nose on their face." That's she translated that phrase for us to English, and that's what it meant. And she said that while you're meeting in these 20 minutes, in the next room, the snacks and the food is already laid out for the extended family to celebrate. So in that context, the possibility of saying no is severely curtailed. You're going to upset all of these arrangements that everyone's made to celebrate in anticipation of your yes. So saying no is going to be very, very difficult in this context. So what we argue is that the boundaries and the step between consent and coercion are often blurred and I shall step back if that's okay, so you can see me. So I'm used to lecturing face to face. So if you think of consent at that end and coercion at this end, what we argue is the two ends look very far away from each other, but between consent and coercion, there's various little steps such that they connect to each other. So at that end, there's consent, where you can completely say no. Then one step towards coercion is you can say no to this particular proposal, but you're going to have to say yes to one of the other future proposals that comes your way. And we recognize that as you get older, you will get worse and worse proposals. So if you say no to this, the next one may not be as great, the next one may not be as great, and then 5 no's down the line, you'll get a reputation for being a fussy woman, which no one likes a fussy woman, do they? Men could be fussy, but in our world, there's gendered consequences if you get labeled as a difficult woman. So in that context, saying no comes at a cost. Yeah, you can say no, but so you're moving towards this way, or you can say no, but for a while, but you have to get married. There's no option other than marriage for a woman. So you're coming closer this way. If you say no and keep saying no, our family reputation will be damaged. Your sisters won't get married. There's an order of marriage which goes by age. So this, again, this Orthodox Jewish community woman we spoke to, she said there's an order of age. So each sibling gets married, the oldest one gets married. And if you delay your marriage, your siblings' marriage will get delayed. And maybe one of them wants to get married. So you're responsible for the unhappiness. So then there's no pressure. If you say no, your father's ill, he wants to see you married before you die, okay. If you say no, there's lots of tension in the house, people are not talking to you, everyone's upset. If you say no, we won't fund your studies anymore. You can't pay for your own studies, we're not going to. Then there's physical pressure, and so you reach coercion, but they connected through ideas of compulsory marriage, through ideas of heteronormativity. So your sexuality might be, you might be exploring it, you might not be certain, but there's no option for that. So these are the ways in which there's steps between one and the other. Enrique, can we have the next slide, please? Oh, sorry, and not Enrique. Yeah. So we are interested, it's important for us to understand the steps between consent and coercion. And within this understanding, we also think it's really important to be grounded in gender is a really important lens we found in our research to understand forced marriage. And what we see in the UK, I think we see it less in other European contexts, is a degendering of understanding of different forms of violence, like domestic violence. In the UK government policy, the recent domestic violence bill, the bill itself doesn't recognize that domestic violence is gender, though following criticism by agencies, the guidance that comes along with it recognizes that the majority of victims are women. So there's a similar move in forced marriage, saying it can happen to anyone. Yes, it can happen to anyone, but it's more likely to happen to women, far more likely, and it looks different when it happens to men and women. And I'll come to that in a minute. So I think it's really important to hold gender as a key concept, but think about how gender intersects, how it comes together with other social relations of power, such as those based on disability, on class, age. So in terms of class, it's educational opportunities. For example, in US research, we know that parents can say, we're not going to fund your studies, or there's an implicit understanding that you're reliant on your parents in a context where university education is privatized, sexuality. So there may be a whole range of other social relations of power that intersect with gender to shape both coercion and your capacity to consent. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So I've got a couple of quotes now from research that I've done to bring out some of these issues. So this one is from, I call her Sarah. She was 23 when I interviewed her, and she talked about being coerced into marriage when she was 16 then. She was taken from UK to Bangladesh, And she was abandoned there for 18 months, married off to someone when she had clearly rejected the possibility of marriage. They took her on a pretext of a holiday to her country of origin. Her parents took her, mother took her actually, and she was left there till she was pregnant and beyond the possible period for having an abortion, and then they let her come back, knowing that now she was trapped, she couldn't leave. um, he was horrible. He would hit me and use a knife to scare me, to get me to have sex with him. My nights were literally fighting him off, and I eventually got pregnant. While I was in Bangladesh, I started to self harm. She's just 16, yeah? And she's been left there away from everyone she knows in a joint family context where she's living with her abuser. When I was in Bangladesh, I started to self harm just to try and make sense of the trauma because I didn't know what I could do, who to turn to. Somehow I made the connection like this is how I can deal with my pain. None of the relatives intervened because they all thought this is what my mom wanted. And they probably had their own agendas as well. She was sending money over, and they probably, she was sending money over, yeah. My uncle's wife would say, if she doesn't want to sleep with you, just leave her alone. She's young. But that's as far as it went. Once I was 4 months pregnant, I was brought back over here. She came here, she gave birth to her child, and then there was pressure to sponsor his visit over. Um, and the understanding was if you sponsored his visit over and settled, maybe you'll have more space. She did go on to sponsor him over. He came, and gradually she negotiated more and more space. She'd lock herself in her room at night. They lived in the same household. Eventually, she left and she went to a refuge. And she described this time in the refuge as the first time she had a normal childhood. At the refuge, they were going to plan a small party for me. It was my birthday. She hadn't quite turned 18 yet. And that was the first time that had been done, because before that, when I was at home, that it was like no parties, no birthday. At school, I'd make up stuff like, oh, I got these presents. But now people were actually coming together for me, asking me what type of presents I'd like. Stuff like that had never happened to me. So coming to the refuge, leaving, her whole world opened up. She left that abusive relationship, but she also, the whole range of other kinds of support that she got. And after I interviewed Sarah, she was one of those few respondents, people you interview, people have sometimes have chaotic lives when you've just left an abusive situation, and it's a very period of mobility. You're getting rehoused if you come through a refuge. So she stayed in touch with me, and when I spoke to her later, when I finished preparing this report, she had completed her nursing degree, and she asked to see the report. She read the whole report. We had a long discussion. Sometimes that's not possible also because the people I may interview may not have come through formal education to be able to read research reports. So you have to think of how do you communicate research findings. So this is the first time I was able to engage with my work, written work, with someone I had interviewed. So it was quite interesting. Can we move to the next slide, please? So for Sarah, her whole options became really, they shrunk when through the process of being coerced into the marriage, but also after she was coerced into the marriage. She had a child, she was forced to sponsor him over, and it was really difficult for her to leave. And when she left, she was looking at 18, she was looking after a young child. Eventually, she did manage to study alongside, but by leaving, she had violated all the norms in her community. So she had to cut herself off from her community. Now, in another research that I did, I spoke to women who had been, so some very different contexts, who had been, who were in a transnational marriage with men in the UK, and they talked about their experience after marriage. And as we talked to 57 women, and a third of them, we realized from their accounts that the men had been coerced into a marriage. So we could sense that men had been pressurized to marry someone. So these are men living in the UK and other parts of the world who'd been pressurized to marry someone who was South Asian because their family preferred that person. Sometimes because the men were in relationships with other women who the family didn't approve of, and occasionally because men were in relationships with other men. And for the family, even acknowledgement of their sexuality was completely not possible. And so they not only had to hide their sexuality, but they had to do so by marrying someone who their family chose. So this woman, just pre 29, said, I got my visa after many months apart. So she came to Italy, actually. When I hugged him at the airport, he didn't hug me back. He started reading a book in the train on the way back home. He had nothing to say to me. So he married her because the family said, you got to do that. But then, and sponsored her over, but then blanked her out when she came. And she's coming from a village to Italy, doesn't speak a word of Italian. He does. And so she's talking about her life here. When I spoke to him, he would talk back to me in monosyllables. So my whole time there was like starvation, language problems. He'd get his own takeaways, and she was left at home all day to cook and look after herself. But she didn't know the language. She didn't know how to go out, shop. So initially, there was nothing to eat in the house. She worked her way through everything in the house and then had to figure out how to go out, how to use the money, all of that. It was a constant struggle. I went out on my own, tried to talk to people, but inside I was suffering. There was nothing from him. So in this case, he's got married to her, but then he's carved out the space for himself by ignoring her. But it has consequences for her because she's in a context where there is no source of support, and she has no way to make a living without some sort of input from him. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So that was a benign form of neglect. So he's being coerced. You can see he doesn't want to get married, but it has consequences for her. What was more common was where the implications were more than just benign neglect and harm arising from that neglect. Men who were pressurized into marriage on account of the family's rejection of their relationship or deviant sexuality, their accounts sometimes also revealed the coercion that they'd been subjected to, the victimization in terms of being forced to marry, but also a secondary and sometimes direct victimization that they condoned or actively colluded in of the women. So Bina, 26, says, soon after I came here, she came to the UK, I realized that the marriage was a sham. He stayed away from home for days at a time. When I questioned him, he said, you're nothing to me. I married you for my parents. Your job is to look after them. When I complained to his parents, they said it was up to me to make him want to stay at home. So they said, you have to, through your sexuality, and this is often in these contexts, pressure that's put on women, you've got to make him want to stay with you and give up this other woman. And as far as he was concerned, he's done his job, he's married her. Now her job is to be a maid, to be a carer for his family, to look after them. So it's quickly become a situation where he's colluding with her, with the exploitation of her productive and reproductive labor. I think in this case, she was also sent to work and her wages were appropriated. And often in this context, there was other forms of violence from the wider family that he turned his eye away from and therefore enabled. In another case, Bhavi says 6 months he would come to India. He came to India every 6 months. While in India, he would take me to various hill stations, tourist destinations, but every time his partner, a man, would also come with us. Once or twice, I saw them having sex. During that time, I became pregnant. So he also expects sexual access to her, but it's a cover for his other real relationship. I was happy to learn that she was pregnant, but he started beating me with a stick and an iron chain, which led to a miscarriage. So in this case, you can see that he's been victimized, but very quickly it's evident that he's also a perpetrator. So sometimes it's complex that both victimization and perpetration can occur at the same time. And as practitioners, for us, when we look at men's experiences of forced marriage, we also need to be very aware that there's in the context of gendered power inequalities, particularly where there's marriage migration, the women in that marriage may also be victims, and sometimes they may be the primary victims. Can you move on to the next slide, please? So, some thoughts from this on issues around gender, disability, sexuality. So before I come to this, actually, let me think. Okay, I'll bring that up. An analysis I'm doing recently, I'll bring that up later. So if we look at data, for instance, in the UK on who's being supported in relation to forced marriage, so there's very little broader data. So the only figures we have is from the government's Foreign and Commonwealth Office Forced Marriage Unit, there's a phone line and people call in. So they support around 1,400 people every year on average over the last several years. And if you look at the gender makeup, it's 80% female victims, 20% male victims. And immediately, it's less gendered than intimate partner violence, which, so if you define that violence as a pattern of behavior rather than a one-off incident, you can see that intimate partner violence is more gendered than this. So 80-20% is the split, 20% male victims, 80% female victims. 10% of the victims have learning disability. But if you zoom in carefully on who are these 10% of victims with learning disability, you find that overall, it's between 50 and 60% of those with learning disabilities, victims of forced marriage, are men. So immediately the gender pattern is very different. Usually it's 80% women, 20% men. But as soon as we see people with learning disabilities, it's 50 or 60% men, 40-50% women. So what's going on here? And this again picks up on a theme that I've been talking about. So I've been talking about gender and how gender shapes the experiences of forced marriage. Disability also shapes the experience of forced marriage when it intersects with gender. So for men and women, so those who are with disabilities, the experience of forced marriage or even the rates of forced marriage are different. So if you're a man with learning disabilities, you're more likely to experience forced marriage than if you're a woman with learning disabilities. And so we really need to think of what's going on here. In this case, some other research that I'm doing suggests that men are more likely to be coerced into a marriage. So this is a marriage where people with learning disabilities don't have the capacity to consent, than women, because of broader gendered roles in society, which construct women as carers. So their families are getting them married off to women who are then who are migrating to join them, because these women are assumed to be lifetime carers. So they're marrying them off to women who will look after them for the rest of their life and possibly look after their families. And because it's women in our society who are constructed as carers, it's men with learning disabilities who are more likely to get married in what we consider forced marriages. Women are less likely to do so because men don't, we don't construct men as carers. So again, gender, disability, all of this comes together to help us understand what coercion looks like, to understand what is forced marriage. And it's really important to think about the nature of coercion in a forced marriage, not just in the run-up to it, but also what it means in the marriage itself and the consequences of a coercive marriage, of a forced marriage. And I really find it useful to use Liz Kelly's concept of a space for action. And I'm going to step back again, if that's okay. So Liz Kelly, I hope you can hear me when I step back. So Liz Kelly conceptualizes domestic violence, is what she's writing about, as something that reduces the space we have for action around us. So the space we have for being who we want to be, for carrying out our life project. So this space within the context of violence shrinks. It becomes smaller and smaller. So if we apply the same concept to forced marriage, our space for imagining who we are, the possibilities that we have in our intimate life, intimate citizenship, all of that, for pressure to marry shrinks that space because our choice of who our partner is limited. And so we find that our space is becoming smaller and smaller. So someone who's subjected to forced marriage is finding this. Now, what all of this research shows is that this shrinking space how much it shrinks and in what way it shrinks before and after the marriage is shaped by a range of factors like gender, sexuality, disability. So what I've been talking about shows that when women get married, on the whole, from their accounts, it seems as if so their space for action is shrinking. Who they get married to, they no longer have a choice. What kind of marriage is it? They no longer have a choice. What's the nature of sexual relations in that marriage? They often don't have a choice. But they're not allowed to leave that marriage. There'll be consequences if they do so. It's often accompanied by coerced pregnancy or sometimes coerced abortions, so their space shrinks. And from accounts of women, and also in other recent research we've done, we've been speaking to men who've been pressurized into marriage. What seems to happen is their space for action shrinks, they're forced to marry or pressurized to marry. And once they get married to the person their family approves of, they negotiate with their family saying, look, I've done what you wanted me to do. Now let me get on with my life. So their space, instead of shrinking further in the marriage, starts opening up. So their family says, fine, you did what you wanted to, now go off. You can have this other relationship with the other woman. And in relation to that person they've married, their space also expands. They decide whether there'll be sexual relations or not. They decide whether they'll have children or not. They decide if they want sexual relations and she gets pregnant, whether to have whether to get an abortion or not. So their space expands. They decide whether they want whether they want to avail of her labor, whether they want her to work and avail of the money, whether they want her to care for their family. So their space expands. So this is a crucial difference in how gender may shape your experiences of forced marriage. So that's something to look out for. What's happening here? Is their space expanding or constraining? And if it's expanding, then at whose cost? So, and sexuality also comes in. For men who were not heterosexual, their space expanded, but within a limit. So their family said, yes, fine, you married who we want you to marry. You can go off and have this other relationship with a man, but it has to be in a different city. We must never know of it. So it still has to be. So that part of their life and their sexuality has to be hidden from their community. So there's a limit to how much it can expand. Whereas for heterosexual men, there may not be. Everyone knows he's in this other relationship. It doesn't matter. So long as he's got a wife at home who's giving him children. So there's all these contexts. So you really need to think of what's different forms of coercion, how consent is shaped by the context in which people live, but also what are the contexts and consequences of forced marriage, and they are shaped by gender as it intersects with other social relations of power. Can we move on to the next slide? I'm done. So to conclude, I found it really useful in my work to think about continuum. So avoid thinking in binaries, avoid thinking of people just as victim or agents, as people who just choose freely or those who are subjected to constraint. And this constraint can be in many different forms. So I'm not, I didn't put slides here because I'm still analyzing this data from the US. So narratives of women from the US that I'm analyzing now are about young women who, in a context of poverty, neglect, and unmet needs from their parents, formed attachments with predatory older men. And these forms of transactional sexual relations, they form these transactional sexual relations in most contexts. In the UK, for instance, we would term it as child sexual exploitation. But instead of there being several men, in this context, this relationship, this attachment was with one older predatory man. And these girls were as young as between 13 and 15 when they formed these attachments, often with the encouragement of their parents or explicit consent of their parents, in that the parents completely knew what was going on, dropped them off at these houses, or these men came, some 35-year-old men were coming to their house to pick up these 13-year-old girls and spend weekends with them. And so this is the context, and that they formed these relationships with, and their domestic life was one of neglect, sometimes violence from the parents or stepfather, poverty, and they were trying to meet their basic needs of food, shelter through these transactional sexual relationships of which involved abuse and exploitation. But in the context of USA, the laws on marriage, some states have no lower threshold. So if a woman gets pregnant, if a child gets pregnant, the men actually escape a prison sentence. They escape prosecution for rape if they marry the women. So there are pregnancies often an exception to the minimum age of marriage in many states. In some states, there's no lower threshold. So at 13, 14, when they got pregnant, these children, girls, were getting married to these much older men, and they saw this marriage as a choice, as something that they wanted to do. And so I'm trying to unravel what this means. So I'm hesitant to say that they were they had no agency at all. What I'm trying to unpack is how young people exercise what they think is their agency in a context that is full of constraints, where every option is unviable. So in this case, it was not acceptable in their community to be a single mother. Abortion was simply not accessible. There was such social sanction to becoming pregnant, and there was no protecting, safeguarding role by their parents or anyone in their community to protect them from this predatory man. And they felt they're in a range of really impossible options. Marrying was the only viable option. So they talk about themselves as agents, as choosing to marry. They want to marry, but you have to unpack that. And so age is one big factor which says they're not capable of consenting. But beyond that simple age binary, you also have to look at what are the coercive contexts which make a real choice impossible. So this binary is problematic. We need to use continuum thinking to challenge. I think it's also really useful to challenge essentialist constructions of violence against women, saying forced marriage just happens to these communities. So in the US, we're looking at Christian communities in the southern states. I'm reading narratives of Orthodox Jewish women in the US and the UK right now in terms of coercive contexts for marriage. And then there are the Middle Eastern, South Asian women, women from countries in Africa, whose accounts also we're hearing. So it's a whole range of, and in my other research that I've just done, we've come across a huge, in certain parts of the UK, forced marriage narratives of Roma women. And many of them seem to have been, Spain is registered in the police database as their country of origin. So these are, several different communities. And to conclude, I want to reiterate the central role of gender, and that's something that's inescapable. And when forced marriage, whether it happens to women or men, gender plays an important role in shaping their experience of forced marriage, what it looks like. And at the level of prevalence, it's far more prevalent among women and girls. So in the early marriage and child marriage that I'm talking about, pretty much all the cases in the US from broader data as well are of girls marrying older men. It doesn't seem to happen the other way around. So within an intersectional approach, so conceptual ideas like intersectionality is really important. Continuum, space for action is really important for our practice. We need to pay close attention to the context, meaning, and implications of violence based on where people are located in the hierarchies of power in society. Sorry, I've taken 3 more minutes than I was meant to. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Anitha. It was a pleasure to listen to your presentation. It was pretty amazing, actually. I'm pretty sure that we had a lot of thought and insights from your very complex approach. Right now, we will give some minutes for questions specifically to the presentation of Anitha. And after, Virginia will present some questions, not only to Anitha, but to all of us. So common questions that we are facing through this topic. So I open for the questions. If you feel more comfortable because we know that English it's not the mother language for the majority of our public here today. So if you feel more comfortable to put your question in the chat, there is no problem at all. If you want to speak your question directly to Anita, you can just raise your hand. Yes, I can see that Anna Michalekli just raised your hand, so you can speak directly to Anita. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much, Anita, for this very interesting and wonderful presentation of yours. My surname is very difficult to pronounce. I know it's Michalakeli. It's he in Greek. Okay, I just wanted to say that hearing your presentation, I was constantly having images from the the forced marriage strategy that was a reality in Greece, even in the near past, in our rural areas, where this was somehow a common strategy for families to that were in rural areas and were more closed and used endogamy as a strategy. And that in nowadays, when it comes to Greece, we are thinking forced marriages happens only to, let's say, the Roma community. And of course, the issues of intersectionality, how this community lives, if they are in their way of living in open spaces and camps and handmade, I mean, camps. This is the only, let's say, minority that comes to our mind when when we're thinking the Greek context. However, there are still rural areas in Greece that they use this way of reproducing their families and communities, and they're very often again in mountainous areas. I have in mind especially the island of Crete, and it's connected with the way their economy is structured, which is based to drug dealing, to let's say gun trade, and other acts that are not, in the formal economic activity. And I had recently a discussion with colleagues that work in schools and they're social workers or psychologists, and they have recently many requests or information about an increase within also the COVID pandemic of such arranged marriages as a way for this community to keep young men, as you said, young men, in the specific area, in the specific villages, so as to continue this way of working and gaining, what can I say it, way of work and of living. So I was wondering if in, let's say, similar context as ours, what could be a way of work in the field with this population, which is very difficult to be reached because in Greece there is no discussion about arranged marriages. We think that this is something that we have, as society, we have overcome. It's in our past. So such cases, or few cases, are in the binaries of our society. So they don't touch us. And the schools cannot very easily intervene. Local society cannot easily intervene. So if there are any, case studies or approaches to work around these issues, very like to hear your
Thank you.
point.
So I think from what you're saying, it sounds remarkably similar to some of the narratives of the women that I've interviewed, where they talk about, so the most recent interview was with someone from the Orthodox Jewish community in the UK, but also from other Middle Eastern or South Asian communities, where they talk about this is how marriage is. So families negotiate, and sometimes there are things, so in your context it might be about relationship between families, trying to strengthen relationship between two families in the local context, and so those are the contexts in which marriages are arranged. But it's not, arranged marriage in itself is not problematic, because it may be completely consensual. What is a problem is when you don't have the option, or there's a huge pressure to say yes. So once this marriage, that there's lots at stake, and that relies on you saying yes, and therefore the option to say no, it doesn't really exist. And if you say no, then your life will become very difficult. And so those are the cases where then you have to say, actually it was never a yes, because you could never say no. So those are the contexts. But in communities like that, which are very close knit, leaving or saying no comes at a very high cost. The first step is to reflect, or to be able to reflect on how not being able to say no means you could never say yes. It was never a yes. And so the first stage is about conceptualizing what's happening to you as coercion, and that unhappiness at the marriage is actually an indication that this is forced. But the next step of doing something about it, being able to leave, is often very difficult in those communities, because leaving also might entail leaving that whole community. So then what are the costs of saying resisting this coercive marriage? The cost may be leaving your family, leaving all your friends, leaving your community, and not many people may be able to make that step. So often what we find in those contexts is women go ahead with that marriage, but then if that marriage becomes also abusive, then they may have a space to say, I'm going to walk out. But again, that may vary depending on the community they are in. I think the first step would be in schools to discuss the broader idea of consent in terms of relationships, and then be able to apply that, because the notion of consent in relationship also applies to all relationships within marriage, or early dating relationships, intimacies. So I think the first step in those difficult contexts is to think about the concept of consent, and that it might be possible to make inroads to discuss that if the community is receptive in terms of protecting children from, say, child sexual abuse. Consent has a role to play, an understanding of consent in education has a role to play in all of those. So in teaching children about their right to their own bodies, and recognizing inappropriate and appropriate, touch and overtures on their body. And so it might be possible to make a case for incorporating consent in education by thinking through these issues, because those communities may be very resistive if you say, oh, and it's to challenge forced marriages, not arranged marriages, but they might be very suspicious. So it becomes very difficult. I think the first step of naming what's happening to you as violence, as abuse, is often the most difficult step. And then if someone's managed to name that, then the agencies need to figure out measures to support that person in what they want to do. And sometimes they may not want to do something now, but it's about what's possible when they're ready to take action. And in those communities, there's a lot of resistance, and that's not unusual. I've been working in women's refuges in the UK, in South Asian women's refuges. 20 years back, we were shunned by our community. We were in community settings, we were called marriage breakers. And so often there's a lot of resistance to people who are seen as the ones who are disrupting what they think is a working system. So I don't know if that addresses what you were saying, but I also want to pick up Anna's question in the chat, where Anna said, can you share a bit more about the space for action? So Anna, space for action is a concept that Liz Kelly uses, and that concept, it means the agency or the capacity for thinking and action that exists within the constraints you experience in your life. And the space for action is the agency, this capacity of women and girls who are living in an abusive context. So what's the space for action that they have when they're living in an abusive context? It's about how you think. So how you think and see the world. So it's about your cognition, how you recognize the world and how you perceive the world, as well as your behavior, what you're able to do. And the idea of the space for action is that when you live in an abusive context, how you see the world, how you perceive the world, and what you're able to do, how you're able to act, becomes narrower in order to help you survive. So we know that from research with women who experience domestic violence, intimate partner violence, that when they are subjected to a whole range of coercive control, they have to adapt to survive in that context. So for example, if their partner has rules, and coercive control often entails rules. If I ring the phone, you have to pick up before 4 rings, otherwise they'll be held to pay. So they adapt to that coercive context. When the phone rings, they jump up and get the phone because they've adapted. They think this is really important. So this behavior, which normally I would ignore my partner's phone if I'm at my allotment tending my vegetables. I'm like, this is my space. So their way they think of something as mundane as a phone call as something urgent, immediate, that has changed, and their response, they're running to pick it up, has changed. In that, their space for action. Do I answer this? Nah, I'm doing something more interesting. Oh, this is the most important thing in my life now. I've got to get that phone. So their perception and action has changed. It's shrunk because they can't have a range of options. They've got to pick that up because that's the only way they can survive. They've got to, on a day-to-day basis, they have to follow the rules because they have to get through this day to the next day. So it's this idea of how you see the world and how you behave, and that violence constrains your space for action. And the idea that when you leave, the space for action may grow. And research often shows that for women leaving abusive relationships, initially the space for action grows because that perpetrator is not there, though sometimes there's post-separation violence, so it doesn't expand in the way you might think with child contact, with courts, all of that. And sometimes the space expands initially, but then stops expanding because you have other constraints in your life: accommodation, housing, welfare benefits. So you might find that it expands initially and then you face all of that. So there's a limit beyond which it doesn't expand. And that's different for different categories of women. So for in the UK, in the hostile environment we have, migrant women may find other constraints on them, and therefore the space for action may not expand beyond a point. If you don't speak, in women that I've spoken to who had language difficulties, employment, the world of employment was very exploitative for them. They were not being paid the minimum wage. So there was a limit to how much their space for action could expand. The passport, they could not regularize their immigration status because it's cost £1,000 to apply for a passport in the UK. So if you've left an abusive relationship in a context where you marriage migrant, it wasn't possible for her to get a British passport, which meant there was always this fear hanging on her because she didn't have the British passport. So this is the concept of space for action. I find it really useful to think of what violence does. And then in the context of forced marriage, it allows us to critique the degendering of forced marriage, to say, look, the space for action before and after forced marriage looks very different for men and women. So the nature of forced marriage is different. I hope that's clearer. There's something else in the chat from Diana. Is it possible to construct intersectional and culturally sensitive policies against forced marriage? And if yes, how can you imagine them? Do you have examples of intersectional, culturally sensitive approaches? So in this case, I would say recognizing how forced marriage looks would be useful. So recognizing that there are gender dimensions, disability plays, intersects with gender to shape how what forced marriage, your experience of forced marriages and what the impact of forced marriages. So for example, for a man with learning disabilities who we're saying who cannot consent to marriage, when the social workers are his family saying they're going to get him married and they think he doesn't have the capacity to consent and they intervene or after the marriage, they need to also think of what's happening to the woman in that marriage, because there's abuse or at least exploitation of her reproductive labor. So there's two people here to be helped, not just that one person. In the UK, what it would look like is a culturally sensitive policies, not to make assumptions about everyone inevitably in that community is subjected to forced marriage, or not to make inevitable connections between arranged marriage and forced marriage, but to look at the context more closely and see what this looks like. So in the US, for example, there's a whole, there's steps to regularize, to raise the age of marriage to 18, and it's being resisted by conservative organizations, by many Christian groups who are saying parents have a right over their, this is interfering in our family rights, and also it's being resisted. They're putting forward children or 16, 17-year-old girls saying we have the right to choose. We want this marriage to go ahead. So it's then thinking of what's the context in which those choices are being made. They're pregnant. The society is not allowing them. There's no, abortion services are disappearing, so it's not possible. Private healthcare is not really inaccessible for them. State coverage is very patchy, so they cannot afford abortion. Those services aren't there. There's huge taboos against abortion. Single motherhood is not an option. So in that context, if her 25-year-old so-called boyfriend says, yes, I'll marry you, in order to avoid the charge of rape, what chance does she have in saying, I don't want this marriage? So it's about looking at the context to understand what coercion is, rather than assuming that because it's from this community, it's forced marriage. To be able to differentiate between arranged and forced marriage, and to be able to explore context to see coercive marriages where people are saying this is not coercive, to be able to think of, is this, to be able to think of, problematize where consent is claimed in these contexts as well. Does that, it makes sense?
Thank you, Anita. We have a few more minutes if there is any other question to Anita. If not, we can pass to the second part of the event. So I give the floor to Virginia.
Hi, everyone. And it's very nice talking to you all. So from the beginning of this project, one of the things that concerned us the most were the different aspects of the countries that participate in this project. So all of us who have been working together for 2 years now we have found out that we stand at different points of the whole marriage. So, for example, in Greece, where I work, we, as Anna was saying before, we very rarely talk about forced marriage, not in the Greek context, not in the refugee related work that most of us that are in this virtual room today are doing. And that is because when it comes to the migration part of the forced marriage, we very rarely meet people before they get forcefully married or before an arranged marriage. Mostly we meet women who have been married by force at some time many years ago, and who approach us now because they experience domestic violence or other sorts of gender-based violence related to their marriages. The colleagues from Germany, they work with young women who have survived or who have escaped forced marriage, so they meet people directly before or after a marriage. So for us, one of the big challenges were to identify common grounds and good practices that we could then share with other practitioners all around Europe. And also, we really want to be able to make suggestions to the Commission and to the European level on what kind of changes we would want to see in the context of forced marriages. So what we want to do today at this last part of our workshop is to talk with you and to hear your thoughts, both Anita's and all the people who are a part of this workshop, on a few of the core things that we have identified and we think might help us work better with people who have experiences of forced or arranged marriages. So the first question we want to address to you all are, what are the main difficulties survivors of forced marriage face when seeking support? So through your work, what kind of obstacles have you found out that persons who are at risk of being forcefully married or who have already experienced forced marriage face when they try to access the support services in their areas?
Do you want me to come in?
Yeah, sure. That would be very helpful.
So it depends on the context. So for instance, in some very Orthodox conservative communities, so the Jewish Orthodox community from some recent interviews, or other South Asian communities which are very Orthodox, seeking support for forced marriage and trying to leave often means leaving your whole community, all your family, cutting off connections with all the family, and moving to a different part of the country. So therefore cutting off connections with all your friends. So the cost of exit can be phenomenally high. And then if you're trying to prosecute or take some action, even injunction, to prevent the family from finding you. So there may be concepts of honor. So the family may be trying to recover you. And if you want to protect yourself from it and take any legal action, then you've burnt your bridges forever. And so that can be a really big obstacle in terms of seeking support. It's a huge step to take. And then there are economic consequences. So you may still be financially supported by a family. You may have children who are being supported by the family. And so housing, employment, so secure economic, possibilities apart from your physical safety are all issues. In the US context, for instance, for young women from middle-class families for whom university has always been an option, they are relying on parents' finances to get them through university. So for them, saying no and being cast out on their own would mean that their possibility of higher education disappears because it's all privatized. So then it's a different kind of pressure, which may be for middle-class families, not so much working-class families for whom university was never an option. In terms of sexuality, there may be contexts in rural Greece, in different parts of the world, where rejecting a marriage, an arranged marriage, because of your may involve outing your sexual orientation. That might come at a huge cost, especially if you are in a Christian community. So then your faith may be important for you, but then you may be excluded from your faith-based community, and so that the cost then may be very high. In different contexts, though, there may be associated implications for leaving. So it's about trying to understand what those implications are. And for many people, they may want that relationship with their parents to continue. And so recently, in the research, I spoke to a young woman, and she had left her family home because of pressure to marry. Eventually, so in the UK, so there's this little discrepancy, which is really hard to get rid of. So if you're being fostered, if you're in the state care, even for one day, you are entitled at 18 to have your housing benefit for a flat. If you're not in state care, after 18, the housing benefit only entitles you when you get it, and there's conditions on how you get it, for a room in a shared accommodation. Yeah. But for many women, young women who leave forced marriage, they don't go to foster care, they go to a refuge. And so it's just this, it's not considered foster care. And therefore, the only accommodation that was available to this woman was in a room in a shared house when she turned 18. She got evicted 3 times. The house was horrible. She was trying to sit exams. One eviction happened right in the middle of the exam. She thought she faced the prospect of homelessness. She went back to her family. But she talked about how things had changed in her family. So I interviewed her after she'd gone back, and she said things are different. She was doing a course part-time, working part-time. She kept her earnings for herself, and she had negotiated, because she said, my father knows that I left once and I could leave again. I know how to do it. He also knows I came back. So there's something there, but he knows I could leave. And so things were different for her, and they were different for her sister. And so people also, power relationships change. And when power relationships change, exercise of power, the forms change. And so she had managed to, she went back. So it was it looked like a story of, a negative story, but actually she had renegotiated her place in the family, and her father had to give in many ways. So the dynamics also shift. So it's about how do you intervene in that balance of power to make it possible for her to have a wider space for actions. And sometimes things might fail and she might go back, but now she knows more. She knows more about her options. So there might be things she would do differently that she didn't do. So sometimes as practitioners, we get disappointed, because in front of us, we might see what we see as failures, or what our funders see as failures. But in the longer term, if we followed up, we'd see that they were the first steps towards, gaining a sense of control and space for action. But we might miss that. So I don't know if I answered your question.
It's very helpful, and I really like the example that you shared, because it also highlights the fact that we always need to remember that even people in this kind of situations still have agency. So renegotiating power or having access to services does not necessarily mean that we will have the happy ending that us as practitioners would envision for people we are working with, but this doesn't mean that any other outcome is a negative outcome. People get to challenge the structures within their families, and they get to renegotiate their place in the hierarchy, and to try to get a better outcome of their lives. So that's really interesting, sharing this last example. I would be very interested to hear if there are any other thoughts from other participants of the workshop, or maybe people who live in different parts of the world, about other difficulties faced by survivors of forced marriages. And I think the Tatiana, is it correct name? We lost the hand. Any other thoughts on difficulties that might work as obstacles for survivors? I mean, what I can do is I can share the second question that is closely related to this one, and it is about whether our services offered in the different parts of the world, in Europe mostly, from us who are here, also are accessible to people who need support. So the second question is, if we have identified, if any of us here has identified any good practices concerning the structure of available support. So what works, what makes available services accessible to people who have experiences of forced marriage? And also, if you have noticed whether the attitudes of professionals, of us as professionals, towards survivors and potential victims play any role in the success of the interventions. So the way we think of the people who get our services, if it affects the outcomes of our interventions. So again, if Anitha wants to share her thoughts first, and then we can hear from everyone else.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. Can I come in?
Yeah.
There's a couple of people who want to chat, so I don't want to hog the space. I'm just looking. So they are on similar lines. So in my experience, I've found in the UK context, so this is not something that's, I'm not sure of the extent to which this debate is ongoing in the European context. In the UK context, I've found that it's really important to have what we call by and for services. So in a context where leaving or even reaching out for support comes at a very high cost, trust becomes a really important issue to enable someone to reach out, secure in the knowledge that they will be able to make the decisions. You will give them the information, you will give them the support, but you will not be a source that constrains their space for action. So if they feel coerced or judged into taking particular stances, then you are another constraining force in their life. They're not going to exchange one constraining force for another. So they want that space to decide. And that decision may not be to leave right now, maybe to leave later, maybe to go back and then try again. So trust becomes really important. And in that context, I've found that by and for services are really important. So though there's this broader narrative that, oh, services are for everyone, it's all the same. If you really want to build that relationship of trust and reach people, on one hand, mainstream services need to be accessible to everyone because you can't have by and for services everywhere. But you also need specialist by and for services, and by which we mean services which are by the people who you're seeking to support, and they're for those people. So independent, small organizations. So for example, someone mentioned Roma communities where they're encountering this issue. Now, there's so many other issues of broader prejudice against that community, stereotypes, racism, disadvantage, inequalities, that trust would be very difficult to build. And in that context, if there was funding for self-organization within that community, who are, there'll be voices within that community who are seeking to make change from a position of from within that community. So if they were funded, then that would be a huge step forward in enabling women from that community to reach out to those services, because the issue of trust, and they will. So what I hear is they understand where I'm coming from without judging me. And so that is a really important first step to enable access. I don't know what the political climate is in Europe. So in France, for instance, there's this whole language around assimilation, where difference and different needs are simply not recognized as significant. So I think from an intersectional conceptual perspective, it's really important to understand that it's not, everyone doesn't experience abuse in the same way. they experience it through the lens of gender, sexuality, race, all of that, they come together. So your experience of abuse is different from someone else because there's common aspects, but there's also specific aspects. So for me, the buy and for services, so if there's a community you're really struggling to reach, something that's for that community would be really important. So I was talking about this recent interview with an Orthodox Greek woman who's trying to self-organize, Orthodox Jewish woman who's trying to self-organize on the issue of forced marriage within her community. We were talking to her, and it's at a very early stage now. And so the only reason why people are reaching out to her is she's from that community. She understands the context. If I went out into that community, there's no way I would be welcomed. And no one would talk to me about their experiences. So she's organizing, and she has lots of other people who have come to her, disclosed, and are seeking her support. They won't seek support from other organizations. So it's about making it possible for them to come to you.
So one good practice that we could maybe take out of this is maybe try to focus on interventions that start from the communities that are mostly affected and that include persons that could build trust more easily with people who are experiencing or are at risk of forced marriage disease. And also, generally speaking, trying to create a situation where the survivor is the one who chooses what they will do moving on and when they will do whatever they choose to do. So us as service providers are not another actor of coercion or someone who takes away their consent. So we are not perpetuating the situation from which they're trying to exit. Thank you, Anita. It was very, very helpful. We have a hand, I think, Tatiana.
Yeah, hello. Sorry, I was just kicked out a bit, so I have not been following the last 10 minutes or 5 minutes. I have a question because we're now mainly talking about women going out of, well, women, the victim, going out of that relation. Are there any approaches of addressing the, well, I say men now, yeah, for example, who are beating their women, who are violating them? I mean, taking the other approach, not one leaving, but the one who causes a lot of the problems, to work with them. Do you know of any projects, any data, whether that's successful or not? Because, I mean, if the woman leaves, the next one comes in, basically. I mean, that's what we often see.
So there's a big research on a respect perpetrator program in the UK, which looks at, so we know from different forms of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, that men are serial perpetrators. So when one abusive relationship ends, the next one's also abusive. But, and so there was this big research project on perpetrator programs on trying to work with perpetrators to change. So this is called secondary prevention. So your prevention is after the perpetrations happen, so with people who are perpetrating. Now, there's a whole range of issues with this. First, the biggest is the perpetrator has to recognize that their behavior is problematic and want to change. So in lots of research with perpetrators who have, and this respect, it's called Project Mirabelle. It's hard to type while I'm chatting, so I'm just going to put, oops, sorry, I can't do both at the same time. So I've just typed it, the name of the project, so you can look it up. So there is research on perpetrator programs which indicates their effectiveness. So this was a very thorough research at reducing physical violence. Definitely there was, that was the biggest impact. And there were smaller impacts on other forms of abuse, economic control, psychological abuse, and much lesser reduction in use of coercion and control. So you could reduce certain forms of violence, but again, the big issue is that the men have to want to participate in the program. They have to, and often in these programs, the men who do participate do so because they're staring at a prison sentence, and this is the option. And so it's not necessarily out of their own self-realization and need to change, it's because this is the alternative to custody, custodial sentence, or because there's issues of domestic violence that have been raised in child custody and residence arrangements, and therefore they need to demonstrate to the court that they're reflecting on their previous perpetration of domestic violence. So motivations really matter. So I think working with perpetrators, it's an important plank to work with those men who want to change, but they're few and far between. I think what is more effective if you're thinking of working with perpetrators is also to think of early work. So these patterns in relationships are established early on. So I think we need to do more work with young people in their early first relationships, because they're still learning what relationships are and how to conduct relationships. So at those stages, an intervention would be, again, so there's no systematic research which looks at effectiveness at different stages, but an effective relationship education at school, which engages with the notion of consent in relationships and healthy relationships, and pleasure in terms of sexual violence in early relationships. So we don't talk about pleasure in relation to sex and intimacy. It's just a taboo. And so it's about engaging with those issues early on to shape people's first and then subsequent relationships. And we don't do enough of that. So we step in when it's actually as they say, the ship has sailed.
Thank you.
And I think this ties well with what was mentioned before about interventions at the school level, and also working on teaching consent and what it means in these early relationships and how we can incorporate it in all kinds of relationships in our lives. So this might not be a good practice with regards to services to people who have already experienced a forced marriage or are in danger of being married forcefully very soon, but the project shared, but also the intervention at young ages, focusing on relationships and consent, is also a good practice that we can take out of this discussion with regards to prevention of forced marriages. And I would say that the consent discussion is maybe the most important discussion we can have that is related to most types of gender-based violence. So incorporating consent in young people's education is really important and could be an essential change in the way we experience violence. I don't know if there are any other participants who would like to share any good practices they have identified in their areas on how to support survivors before we move on to the next question.
Can I just come in? One little question, sub-question from, does the attitude of professionals towards survivors and potential victims play any role in the success of intervention? So what's come up again and again in my interviews is when practitioners are seen to be judgmental of their communities, survivors step back. So if they say, yes, we know this is what happens in your community, yes. And so even today in our discussion, we've had slippage between arranged and forced marriage. And so that slippage is problematic if it comes through in your everyday language. So if you say, yes, we have a problem of arranged marriages, if I was from that community, I would immediately step back and say, why is arranged marriage problematic? You have dating relations, you go on dates. How is that not arranged? You've already decided and ticked the criteria of who you want to meet. You've decided which age, which height, what hobbies, all of that. So you're arranging a marriage there through a dating agency. How's it different? And so immediately I would bristle at that and say, they will not understand me. They've already decided what my community is like. And this is again in the US interviews that I'm analyzing right now. This has come through from different, religious, church, particular sects or Jewish community or Middle Eastern communities. When professionals have said something that sounds judgmental of their whole community, they immediately step back from to a position of not trusting.
Thank you, Anita. Maria? We can't hear you, maybe. Yeah, excellent.
Speaking of good practice, maybe I want to share one we are working on. So, first of all, as an organization here, La Voix des Femmes, we are, one of our first step was to, with others, to try to create a network of organization working and thinking, and to have a space of action and reflection on how we can work on this issue of forced marriage and then honor-based violence. So one of our main mantra is to work, to have a network and to enlarge the network and to share, to try to share some vision of the work. So from the very beginning, we work on different, because we are composed of organization of first line and second line. We have tried to, first of all, to work in school, to make awareness raising activities, and then to form professionals. And after training this professional, obviously, we try to maintain contact with them. One thing we have done is to try to have good relationship with police, because in certain cases it's essential. And we have formed quite strong bond with some persons within the police that can help us in some situation. So that first experience was enlarged now, and we are working now with all, in the French-speaking part of the country, with all the specialized organization, and we are now in a 5 years project to have to try to share the same vision and the same understanding, and obviously we evolve every day, but the interesting thing is that we agree to share the same vision, and that trust issues is one of our core value within all the organization, and we try to work together. And now the first year we have decided to make a protocol of intervention to be sure that we share more or less the same vision of the work, and we are working on having collaboration convention with the different sectors to be sure that we can share with other sectors, the youth sectors, the social worker sectors, and the different sectors all over that part of the country. And so we are meeting them, we are sharing our work, we are sharing our practice, and we try to build trust with them also. And so we have created a helpline, a free one, when the people can, the professional and the potential victims can call. So that's for the first year. The second year, we are going to share our practice in training professionals and to have a kit of trainings, so that to have a common one that we can spread all over the country. And then the third year will be training of trainers, because we not only want to sensitize the professional, the frontline professional, but also different kind of professional that could be in contact with potential victim of forced marriage. And for example, we are going to train people who work with migrant population in different organizations. And the idea is, again, to share a common view, to be sure that based on that trust and based on that shared experience, we are going to be much more effective when helping and answering to the needs and to the demands of the people that get in touch with us. And well, that's what I wanted to share with you. And I think that there are in this conference other people from that project. And I wanted to say that we have different specializations too, and people working with different communities. We have, for example, the GAMS, working more specialized on genital mutilation and forced marriage. We have an organization which is specialized in receiving young people, Droit des Jeunes, specialized especially on that. We work more with migrant women, so we share that and that's very rich because we can touch, even though we are not always from the community. I think that knowledge, the different knowledge we have, we can put it together and make it easier for us to try solutions and to enrich our work.
Thank you, Maria. And the plan sounds like really well thought out, and we have discussed internally, because Maria is part of the FMOut project as well, the importance of networking and sharing our knowledge with other professionals. And this workshop is also part of this idea that we can all share what we know, and taking into account that we have different realities that we are facing, and sharing these different viewpoints can help us make our approach better and more successful for the people who come to us to ask for help. So thank you very much, Maria, for all this additional information. Hila, do I pronounce correctly the name?
Yeah. Sorry. I would like to share something from our organization. I work in Germany, in Hamburg, and I think for us, for my organization, the intersectional perspective is the most important thing, and the most, what was the question? The most important thing, because as we see in Germany, forced marriage is kind of seen as something cultural. It's a cultural thing, and it's treated only by this. And I think I missed the intersectional view of forced marriage, and you cannot just treat it as something cultural, because the focus is also on Muslim communities, and there are some big organizations working on that topic. And as we think, being having a really racist view on that, and what happens is that it's not going to that way, that we raise the options for people, but the families are criminalized. There are like even more strict rules against the family and this, but we don't see that we're getting more options, or we get more money to make more options. And this is really problematic. And this is, of course, also because the biggest organizations, we don't have so many intersectional organizations working on forced marriage in Germany, and even in Swiss and Austria, the organizations working on that topic mostly don't have the intersectional view. And these are the only ones. And I think this is our biggest problem we have here. That's why I was really grateful for the intersectional view, because my organization, my colleagues, this is how we work here. We see all the problems, but we kind of feel lonely with that view.
Thanks, Hila. So it sounds like the funded organizations are the mainstream ones who have this essentialist, culturally essentialist perspective, and then who are driving interventions which may be against the wishes of the survivors and victims, in terms of putting their family, criminal justice attention on their family, in a context where those families may already be at the receiving end of racist responses from the police and from the state. So then they're thinking, so it's about exchanging one form of violence for another. So protecting yourself from one form of violence, and then subjecting your family to another. So for them, that option may not seem viable. They may not see that as an option that they want to pursue. So it sounds like you're in a position where self-organization by unfunded groups, or by groups which have very little funding, becomes a very important source of support for people who want to reach out to someone they can trust. But it becomes very difficult to sustain this. So, and I've found in my experience, where in contexts where this is happening, it's often survivors themselves who self-organize and try and get some funding, but sometimes it's very minimal because they can see that the provision is needed, but the mainstream provision does not feel like a place that is they can trust. But having no funding means that there's where you can't offer options, but you can be a conduit, an advocate, and a sounding board. It's not it, and that's not enough. So am I, hearing you right? It's a difficult situation. I think it's often in some countries, so in France as well, there's a reluctance to recognize specific particular needs. Even in the UK, this is there, I think, but we have had historically, we've had there's been a long history of self-organizing by, say, South Asian women, which has led to funding of refugees, but that's under threat now. The specialist spine for services are closing. So there's a debate about it, and there's, a political will within the sector to hold on to it, but I won't hog your time. I've got 2 more hands there.
Thank you, Hila and Anita. I'm going to give the floor to Kayla and then Corinna. I just want to bring another aspect to the discussion so we can all keep it in mind that what we're talking about also has a transnational aspect. So the examples that Anita was sharing, many of them happened in different countries. So people were taken out of where they're living, where they grew up, and then they were taken back. So also keep in mind this aspect when sharing your answers and your suggestions and your good practices. And maybe, Sarah, if you want any measures or structures that would be needed with regards to this transnational aspect of forced marriages. Kayla?
Yes, thank you very much. So yes, as Maria said, we work in this network. Thank you, Maria, for the presentation. And I was wondering, because GAMS, the organization I was working for, it's specialized in female mutilation, genital female mutilation. And we try to work with the community. We work with the member of the communities. So we find volunteers from the communities concerned by FGM, and most of the time also by forced marriage. And we try to train them, and after it's they serve as a bridge between the victims, the survivor, and the professional. And it's also a way to involve the community. But in forced marriage, because we are a small organization, we have less experience. But I was wondering, what do you think about this kind of practice? Do you think that we have to develop this kind of practice? Really try to involve the community, the member of the community, and training the member of the community about gender, about violence, and after they could serve as bridge between the survivor and the professional. And also it's a way, because it's important in the when we face this kind of issue, it's also to involve the community. Yes, that was my question. Thank you.
I think it's a really positive way of making change. So on one hand, you need services, statutory interventions, because some changes will take a long time, and there are some needs which are urgent, and there's a crisis situation, so you need external intervention. At the same time, for longer term change, I think self-organization and voices from within the communities who are already calling for change need to be amplified and supported. So that's what you're doing. You're tapping into the voices within that community for change, and those are the voices that are going to be listened to if you want to achieve a longer term change. So with any work on challenging violence against women, we are all engaged, and I've been working in a refuge as manager, as caseworker. So there's crisis work, there's immediate work when someone comes to you in fear for their life. So you do that work, but we don't expect to be maybe I've been doing this for 20 years, so I'm saying it with okay, let's see. So we don't expect to be doing this work for the rest of our life. We don't expect to be just doing crisis work for individual women who are in fear of their life. And if at the end, if in another 20 years time, that's the majority of my work, It'll be a sad lifetimes project, because ultimately we hope that while we do attend to the individual cases of crisis, we are aiming for a longer term change in shift in cultural attitudes, shift in what is possible for women and girls. And so what you're doing is really an important part of achieving that broader shift. And like I said, even in individual cases, families change, power dynamics shift. Communities are not static. They are adapting, they are changing, and we want to be part of that change by amplifying voices which call for that change, and empowering those who are calling for that change. And it may sometimes be hard for funders to realize that these are longer term processes, because they want immediate outcomes, and they want outcomes that you can measure, which is hard.
Thank you, Kayla and Anita. Corinna?
Yes, I'm from the German organization Papatya, who is part of this project. And I don't want to open an inner German discussion, but I cannot let stand what the other woman from Germany said. I think we have quite a good infrastructure against forced marriage in Germany by now. We have about, I would say, 10 specialized shelters for girls and young women where they can turn to. We have helplines which are specialized. We have laws who say that nobody is allowed to marry now under the age of 18 for whatever reason, but it's not allowed at that age. And there is no prosecution of parents. Of course, forced marriage is punishable now, but if a girl does not want to criminalize her family, which is totally understandable, then there is no pressure whatsoever on her to do this. She can just run away, find shelter. At the shelters, we have intercultural teams. That's the normality, that it's not like bio-German women addressing women from other cultural backgrounds, but it's very, very mixed. And the first organizations which started about 30 years ago to work, they were funded by survivors, by women who were forced to marry and who then started their own organizations, and they were funded also to some part. So I wanted to just to contrast this rather black image of Germany, because I feel it's not justified. And for example, what you told about the young woman from the UK, we worked with organizations in UK too, with ICRL in London, and we now know social Black Sisters. And I think, in my view, really in the UK, the problem is that you cannot have housing. And for example, in Germany, if you are a young woman and you can come to a shelter mostly up to the age of 20, 21, and then afterwards you get housing, you get financed. You can even move, if you're above 18, you still can be moved into shared flats with other young girls who have the same fate, and then there some social pedagogues will take care of you. And you are not forced out in the streets, you are not forced that you lose your housing. So I think there are many aspects which already work quite well. Also the networking, which Maria said, we have big networks as well on the community, not the community, the city levels, but also all over the land, where all these organizations who work against forced marriage find connections and talk together about all these issues, and also interprofessional ones. At Berlin, for example, we have a work group against forced marriage for 20 years now, and there people from the police are sitting in. There's people from the job centers who take part of this and who together think to how to make chains of intervention which help victims of this kind of violence to find support and to be reached from person to person if necessary. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Corinna. And what I think we can keep from this discussion, because this is common. I mean, I can sympathize with both the positions that were shared. What is common in our work is that often we feel alone, even if we are not. And because we are constantly in this emergency mode, and it doesn't look like this is going away. Many times the fact that we have to respond to urgent cases all the time, and the situation around us does not necessarily get better, unfortunately, it makes us many times feel lonely, and it makes us forget that there might be very significant steps that have been taken and very significant networks in place that exist. So I think we can keep that in mind, and also keep the very positive steps that have been made in several countries that have been shared here.
Can I come in for a second?
Yes, of course.
So again, what I took from what you said, sounds like you're doing really excellent work in Germany. There's really some interesting work going on. And so you're saying it's multicultural team, and that's great. So I want to reiterate that mainstream organizations need to be open and approachable to everyone. So that's a minimum. But there is also a need for by and for services so that we can maximize our reach. And in an ideal world, there would be solidarity and space from the big organizations. And in the UK as well, we are not necessarily seeing it. Some of the big organizations are bidding for contracts that were historically awarded to independent providers by and for specialist providers. So the language of specialism is also a political, and there's a debate. So when earlier the term specialism was used for by and for services by and for the women that they're seeking to support, now the term specialism has started being used as women only domestic violence services. So we definitely need women only mainstream domestic violence services, which are accessible to everyone. But within that broader concept, we also need by and for services which are run by and for the women that they are supporting. And it's possible in the larger landscape for the big organizations to leave a little bit of space for those other organizations whilst themselves seeking to be as accessible. And that was what true feminist solidarity would look like, because it would enable some people who may not feel comfortable accessing mainstream organizations, however accessible they appear to be. We still inhabit a world where there is racism, there is discrimination. So that informs how you perceive services might be. And therefore, it's, those smaller organizations where by and for services, where they exist in the UK, they have been fully occupied. So they're not running empty. There's a demand for them. So in an ideal world, there would be space for both to coexist. But the funding constraints, all of that, and even the politics of it means that doesn't necessarily happen.
Thank you, Anitha. And building on the last comment that you just made, and as a final question that will conclude our discussion for today, we wanted to ask you and all people here, what kind of institutional change would you wish to see at the European level, at the EU level, in relation to FM-out? What would make supporting survivors easier? And I take that one thing that would make supporting survivors easier would be access to consistent funding, and funding that caters to different kinds of approaches and intervention, not just the mainstream ones that we that are measured directly after the intervention and that ask for these very strict and measurable outcomes, but also funding for services and for interventions that are more long-term and that might not be able to be counted 6 months from the beginning of the project or 2 years from the beginning of the project, but even more long-term interventions that would be able to be measured 5, 10, 15 years after the beginning. So what else would you ask for in terms of institutional changes? And again, I open the floor to Anita and to anyone else who wants to comment.
I'm not a good person to answer this because I don't know enough about how services work in the European context, because I haven't delivered services there and I haven't done frontline work there. I would be a dupe if I tried to say something about it. So I can only talk about my services and context that I'm very familiar with. So I think your other participants will probably be better able to answer this.
Great, thank you. And yeah, that makes sense. And this is part of what we are aiming for in this project, to be able to convey this need for institutional change at the EU level and to ask for it and to advocate for it. So this is the space where we can hear from all of you who work in the different countries in Europe. What would you need? What changes would you need? Hila?
One thing I can think of at the policy level is immigration control is not a useful lens to approach this problem from. And from my work in Australia, for instance, there's a whole, and I think there's some strands of this in the UK as well. There's a focus on forced marriage, which actually frames it within that discourse as trafficking, as slavery, and then makes a connection between that and transnational migration. And a very closely connected aim of interventions in relation to forced marriage is immigration control. And so the support that's available to women in Australia. So when I went there for a conference and spoke to on forced marriage and listened to their initiatives. So domestic women, women with settled immigration status, women who've been who has residency, citizenship. If you seek support for domestic violence, at that point there was no requirement to give evidence. But if you were seen as victim of forced marriage and had support through that route, through the discourse of slavery, you were expected to give evidence. And so there was different requirements, and the residents after a period in the refuge were subjected to your agreeing to give that evidence. So I felt that it was very, very different level of support and requirements, which was not about support, but immigration control. So when you closely tied to immigration control, I think it's not productive, and it does not focus on the needs of the survivors, and it doesn't create an enabling context for people to come forward and seek support. So that's something you could, if we move that way, because we are increasingly border, Europe. So I can see that it might move that way. If it does, that's something to resist, because that is not useful. Those agendas are very different. Our agenda needs to be about broadening rights, and we can't couple it with something that is about restricting rights, even if it means it brings you funding and short-term gains. That's something to just be careful about.
Thank you, Anitha. This is an excellent point. Hila?
Yeah, obviously, as for me, there are many things we're talking about, we're debating about as an organization, what institutions can change. But I will just name one thing I have my focus on. I think I would love to have more options to work with families, because I think this is not a problem which only women or victims have, but this is a family issue. So for me, from my experience, I see that there are a lot of people coming here to our place to get information about forced marriage, but 70% of them are not coming again, because I think I don't give them so many options. So they're like, okay, there is no option, like we have to stay. This is the only option we have. So for me, I would wish to work more with families, because I think I could help even more if we can discuss with the families, if we can talk with the families about the structures in the family, about the options people, young women have. And for me, I just see the options I have to give for girls in when they decided to leave the families. Like if they decide to go that step, I can give them some options, but the most of them don't want that. So for me, I would like to have more options to keep them at home, and to have more options to help, but not always to take them from the families and bring them to some houses or bring them to somewhere else, because like living family, we all know is it's a big thing, and most of them, they don't come back if they know they have only the option to make this forced marriage or the option to leave the family, because this is not an option for all of them.
Can I come in there? On this, I've got several opinions based on work in the UK, but also what I've seen in Australia. So Australia, this whole issue is more recent. And I spoke to some practitioners in Australia, and they were also saying that exit centered services is a problem. Now in UK, we've been around this for a long time. And there's a whole discussion group on forced marriage when this issue is becoming important, and Southall Black Sisters resigned from that government committee because of mediation with the family was put forward as an option. So through a historic engagement with these issues, there's a few things I'm thinking about. So on one hand, the reality is that there may be a situation where exit may not be seen as an option by many women. So there's a small percentage who want to leave, and we need to make it possible for them to leave. We need to make it possible for women and girls facing forced marriage to know that there's an option of leaving, and this is what the support will entail. And they change their mind, they're free agents. They can go back knowing that this option was there and try it again. At the same time, we know many of them may not want to leave. So what do we do then? How do we make it possible? So our main aim is to support them without putting them at further risk. So there is a situation where there may be some people where working with families may put them at risk, in that it is a context where they're being coerced. So they need support, and the family mediation may not be an option because it's a very coercive context that they're living with. So we need to figure out ways where we can carry on supporting them even if they don't decide to leave. So in the UK, we don't work with families in these cases, but where someone's already under pressure and threat to marry, but they need to find other ways of continuing a dialogue with them through outreach services. So it could be through the schools, through by and for services which have an outreach, peer support, so that we carry on our conversations and support with that person who's at the moment not ready to leave. So we need to have a range of options. Some of it may result in shifting the power balance within the family, but some of it may be just empowering them to make that decision to leave. And in some cases, it may require state intervention, and then that it becomes the difficult issues where you decide that this person is at immediate risk and the state needs to take wardship and make that decision because they're very young. And so it's about balancing various things, because there are people who've been killed. We had Shafilia Ahmed, who was killed by her family because she refused a forced marriage. And so there will be occasions where you will assess the risk and say, this person is at immediate risk and we need to make a decision. So it's about understanding what's going on.
I think what you can take from this last bit of discussion with regards to institutional changes that we want to see is maybe we can advocate for more comprehensive approaches that include, as you both are saying, different options being available to people depending on their situation, and also not only focusing on intervening after the fact, but also working before to create a network that supports or promotes consensual ways of relating with each other, also within the concept of the family. So maybe what we can advocate for is this more comprehensive approach of working with people who might be at risk of forced marriage, and taking their needs and their requests into account, and not what we as professionals or as the state or the EU thinks is the way to move forward, tying it also to the fact that many times policies that are supposed to be focusing on gender-based violence in general, but also in forced marriages in particular, are also ways of immigration control, as was saying before by Anitha. Corina?
Yeah, just one more possibly good practice. We have made good experiences with an online counseling line, which is reaching out to girls on a or young women on a very low level. We hope it has a low threshold where you just can approach counselors and discuss your situation and probably also be encouraged and supported over a long time, and don't have to make any decisions, but just have someone who is talking with you about your options and about your possibilities and about your inner feelings. And these processes can be short, they can be long. My colleague who does it, she has some processes which go on over years. And I hope this is a way to reach out to people who are in need, but who don't want to leave their families.
Yeah, it's about information, about holding their hand through a longer period while they're thinking through what's happening. There's a sense of discomfort. They're trying to work their way through whether this feeling, what this feeling means, and they're trying to name what's happening to them as a problem. So all of that takes time. So that sounds good.
And also keeping in mind that we can use technology to our advantage. This is the fact that Corinne is mentioning an online helpline is really important. And again, this is something we can advocate on, incorporating technology to work to our advantage. I'm going to give the floor to Maria as a final comment, and then we will wrap up, and Sonia can do a closing remark. So thank you for all your contributions, Maria.
Speaking of institutional change at EU, we mentioned the migration policy. We could mention also the asylum policy, even though reminds that the gender dimension should be there. I think we could, the institution could be much more assertive on raising the issue and having a directive, because we need legal tools, legal basis on which we can function at EU level. We have the Istanbul Convention, but we don't have any instrument at EU level. And I think it's a necessity, because it will give us the possibility to go further, because right now it's more national issue than an EU one.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions, and they were very useful, and we hope that we will be able to incorporate it into our program. Sonia, if you want to maybe do a closing.
Thank you very much, Virginia. I think we have done a very interesting and productive discussion, also with helpful comments, tips, and reflections about how to approach intervention, advocacy. Thank you very much, Sundari Anitha, for the conference and for the richful discussions we have had during the second part of the European workshop. And welcome to all the participants, of course. And I would like to finish with the last reflection from Maria, the need to get instruments from European Union. I think this is a very good way to finish, to conclude this seminar, because it's necessary if we want to go ahead. We need an European vision, an European approach concerning needs and tools and instruments. So thank you very much, and see you in other virtual and not virtual places.
Would be possible to have the presentation from Anitha? Or the PowerPoint?
Okay. Yeah, we have the archive, so if Anitha allows us, we can make circulate.
Yeah, I've sent it to you, so you can circulate it. And okay. I'm happy for anyone, if any of you want to contact me after this, I'm really happy to have discussions, and I'm really interested in hearing the work that you're doing in your different contexts.
It was amazing. Thank you all. So goodbye.